You are listening to Insights from the Conference Board.
Hello, my name is Sanja Haas, and I'm the Human Capital Center leader at the Conference Board in Europe. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Insights, a series which helps talent executives address challenges and stay informed about current issues across the entire spectrum of human capital. This series is brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, I'm sitting down with Ilaria Maselli, Senior Economist at the Economic Strategy and Finance Center, and Marion Devine, Senior Researcher at the Human Capital Center, the Conference Board in Europe, to discuss their new upcoming report on the 2022 labor market outlook in Europe. A warm welcome to both of you. So, Ilaria, let me start by asking you, why this report?
Good question, Sanya, and thank you for having me here today. Well, I think it all started in the summer of 2021 when we realized that from our, economic outlook work, we realized that growth was going to be strong in 2022. Economic growth was going to be strong. That the labor market was catching up well, was recovering nicely from the pandemic crisis, and it was recovering actually faster than what we saw, for example, in 2008 and 2009 with the global financial crisis. So, we saw coming some things like, strong labor market, strong employment growth, strong economic growth, perhaps wage growth. And we thought, okay, that's a good time, to start a labor market outlook for Europe.
Thanks, Ilaria. Yes, sounds like the right timing. And before we get into what actually the results are of the report, I did want to ask both you and Marion, why did you decide to partner on this topic?
Yeah, Sanja, it's great to be here today as well. Thank you. I think that from our point of view in the Human Capital Centre, we were very aware that talent and labour concerns are really high in the thoughts of our member companies. So every year we do a C-suite outlook where we talk to CEOs, have a survey of CEOs and C-suite executives. And it was very telling that a lot of the responses are about saying we're ready to reset, we're ready for recovery, but a very sort of high concern is labour shortages. And when we asked them about what were they going to be focusing on, number one was attracting and retaining talent. And so we know that European companies are really concerned about, talent, about having the workers in place to really take advantage of economic recovery.
Thank you, Marion. Ilaria, any thoughts on your end on why partner with Marion on this topic?
Well, I thought, once the report is out in a few days and you can download it, it will be clear the benefits of, bringing different practices together to work on this, because I think it's a good way to approach this issue, because, there is the economic dimension of it. There is a lot of demographic changes happening in Europe over the long term, and we really want to understand how companies are reflecting on that. And this is, I think we've done this successfully in this report together.
Yes, and definitely.
I think as well that we have a great positioning with all our forums where we convene our executives and councils, so we can get a really in real time look at how our member companies are responding to the challenges of the labour market and the type of practical strategies that they're employing.
Thanks, Marion and Ilaria. I was going to say, yes, definitely very aware of the human capital challenges, and great to have you both partnering on this topic. However, there is another challenge that just happened. And before we go on, I must ask you one more question, which is, I know you were about to publish, and the Ukraine war happened. Has this, or how has this influenced the insights and the results of your research report? Marion or Ilaria?
Yeah, Sanja, I think from the human capital strategy point of view, I think this has obviously been a huge shock I think that in a sense it will intensify some of the trends that we've seen in this outlook. A very, very strong concern about talent and skills, a very, very strong concern about labour shortages, and our manufacturing companies are particularly already afflicted by this. I think the Ukraine invasion will only make that worse. So I think that in a sense, it makes some of our data, it confirms our data, and I think it also confirms our human capital strategies, because we are in a situation where labour is really short, talent and skills are at a premium, and therefore companies will really have to, I think, double down on the strategies that we are seeing at the moment. So I think it's the context has changed, but I don't think that the solutions and the practical steps have changed.
Yeah,
Thank
good
you.
point, Marion. I think the context has changed, and we are trying to reflect that in the report as well, in the sense that we have included a new section on what companies are doing, for example, to bring staff to safety. But in general, I think, beside the urgency of the situation, from the economic point of view, growth will be still very, very strong. So, not as strong as we expected, 2 weeks ago, but we still expect economic growth to be above average, above trend for this year, in any case, in European countries. And this means, that more jobs will be added, and, everything that we expected on shortages and wages, all these conclusions are still very valid. An interesting question is, to what extent the refugees that are arriving in Europe will contribute to solving labor shortages. And maybe we will come back to this, but I think it's a question worth asking.
Yeah, thanks, Ilaria. And definitely we'll come back to that question. And just want to echo your point about the strong economic growth. It's great to have some good news on that front, because if we look at the human capital talent agenda, there are some challenges there. And clearly, the overall situation is challenging right now. But listen, before we then look into some of the specifics, particularly on labor and wages, what were some of your aha moments and insights as you were going through the data and as you were finalizing the report? Ilaria, can you let us know, did you have any aha moments?
Yeah, definitely a few, but my pick is definitely related to wage growth. We have a forecast for wage growth for 2022, and it shows numbers that are much higher than what we were used in the years before the pandemic. And the benefit of working together with Marion is that, okay, we thought, okay, how are companies going to deal with it? And one answer to that is that companies need to really rethink the employee value proposition. And I think it's a nice way to think, everything that is happening, that has been changed in the labor market in the last years, all the work from home, the impact of the pandemic. Now again, we're facing another major crisis, and it really, it started with wages and it ended up with rethinking, the way we work and what type of offer companies can make to workers.
Marion, and your aha moments, did you have any?
Yeah, Sanja, thank you. It's good question. I think I was genuinely surprised to see that female labour force participation had actually recovered, and that really surprised me. So we knew that during lockdown and with school closures, we knew that had been a disproportionately sort of heavy burden on female workers, and many women had either had to really decrease their hours or work far more flexibly, into the evenings, or even had given up their jobs. So I was not expecting to see that actually that participation has recovered, and actually, interestingly, in the euro area, there's actually 500,000 women working now compared to pre-pandemic levels. And the only countries where that's sort of not the case is Germany and Italy. So it's a little bit patchy across Europe, but it's actually a very, very positive sort of finding. And particularly in the UK, the female labour force participation has recovered nearly fully compared to 2019. So that's very positive. And it did strike me, though, as you know, we're a global company, But the picture in the United States does seem to be quite different, and I don't think they're seeing the same recovery there, and they're seeing that Black women, Hispanic women have been, disproportionately affected. And, and in fact, I think we are just doing a podcast by our CEO on why aren't women returning to the workforce. So it's interesting that Europe has a more positive story to tell here.
Very interesting. And I'd love to get back to both of your points on, the link of the wage growth to the employee value proposition, and this great piece of news on the female labor force participation. So let's take a look at those step by step, the wages and the labor force. Let's look at your analysis and conclusion. The labor market in Europe. What is the state? And in particularly, the wages, and how do you factor this into the overall equation? Ilaria, if we can look at some of the specifics, and then we can go back to looking at, the conclusion for the employee value proposition.
Yeah, so let me start again from the beginning. So 2021, we saw in Europe very strong economic growth, and we saw the labor market recovering from many points of view. If you look at unemployment, if you look at labor force participation, in most countries, really the labor market recovered in the second half of last year. And now, as I was saying, of course, the war in Ukraine will have an impact on growth in Europe in 2022. But despite that, it will still be strong growth compared to long-term averages for European countries. So just to give you some headline numbers, before the war, we expected growth on average in Europe to be in the range of 4%, and now we are revising that forecast by -1%, so somewhere in the range of 3%. So this means that the labor market will continue to add jobs, and we have in the report this interesting double figure that if you look at CEO confidence and hiring intentions on the one side, and on the other side, you look at consumer confidence, on both sides of the labor market, you really see a quite interesting degree of optimism about job prospects, about hiring intentions. So this will have two consequences. One is some shortages, of course, that are emerging, especially in Central and Eastern European countries, in Germany, in the UK, in the Netherlands. This, I would say, it's where they are the highest. So some shortages on one side, and on the other side, stronger wage growth than what we saw in the last decade. And this strong wage growth is really a function of three variables, which are, strong economic prospects, of course, slack in the labor market, and inflation. And that's probably the last one. Inflation is the new thing that appeared in the middle of last year in Europe. We are seeing higher levels of inflation, definitely above 2%, and we were not used to that. And that's actually another element that will suffer from the war in Ukraine, because we definitely expect inflation to be stronger than we forecasted a couple of weeks ago. So this means basically that our wage forecast is perhaps the lower bound. We should take these estimates as the lower bound estimates, and that definitely we should expect strong wage growth also in 2023. We don't have the numbers yet. I think it's a bit too early, but for the next edition of this report in 6 months, we will definitely update the 2022 numbers, but also have numbers for 2023, which I would expect to be strong.
So Ilaria, just to summarize, because there seems to be a lot of good news there in terms of the labor market recovery and the growth numbers. There is this, were I to be correct to say, there is this potential of concern for inflation and wages going up higher than what you had envisaged. Is that correct?
For 2022, we have to see. So we expect inflation to be about 1 percentage point higher than what we forecasted at the beginning of the year. But wages are sticky, so they don't adapt as fast. So what is possible is that the higher than expected inflation of this year will translate into higher wages in 2023. And what we see in 2022 is the result of the higher than expected inflation that we saw in the second half of last year.
Understand. Thank you. I guess a follow-up question to that is then to Marion. What are companies doing in response to the strong expectations for wage growth this year and next?
Yeah, I think, Sanja, that companies are, increasingly segmenting their workers, really thinking about tailoring, flexible, nuanced responses. I think inevitably there will be some jobs where companies, if they're looking to recruit very hard to find skilled, they will have to be, they will be forced to compete on the basis of salaries. But I think we know from other sort of boom and bust sort of eras that this is a limited, a limited sort of tactic really for a while, because then you just get the danger that in demand workers just sort of shop around and keep moving to the next best offer. And that, I think, in this day and age as well is, companies are looking for employees who perhaps have other values than just sort of, high pay. So I think in those sought after skills, there will be performance competition through salaries. And we know as well through the COVID crisis that companies really accelerated their plans for digitalization, introducing new technology, really increasing e-commerce, just really sort of moving forward in some of their modernizing plans. And so again, workers with those type of digital-based skills, tech skills, data analytics skills, digital marketing, etc., they are in high demand. So I think for companies, and so of course, some of the tech companies are competing for these skilled workers. And I think that more traditional companies are going to struggle to compete on wage. And I think what they have to be thinking about is really re-examining what do they bring to the party in terms of being, a large employer, perhaps, and therefore I think they will be focusing on their cultures. I think they will be focusing on worker experiences, and that's to attract talent, but it's also to keep talent. So I think that companies would be very wise to really be keeping an eye on their current workers and make sure that if they're staying put at the minute, especially as Ilaria says, if there's going to be a bit of a lag with salaries and we'll see strong wage growth in 2023, then companies do need to make sure that their current workers are not sort of sitting there biding their time. So I think those strategies are all about really rethinking their employee value proposition, being very clear about what they're offering their staff, why they should stay with them, being very clear, articulating it, really sort of being clear about that when they recruit as well. I think it's there's clearly a big focus on organizational culture, having the culture in place to retain people, having a culture, and with hybrid working, of course, we know that the C-suite, the CEOs are really thinking about what is the impact on culture and worrying a bit about culture being diluted. So it's definitely about finding new ways to help people feel connected, to belong to their organizations, and as we come out of COVID, how to increase that whole area of strong relationships between colleagues across the company. So organizational culture is a really important thing. And if companies want to keep and also recruit diverse workers, then they really have to have a spotlight on inclusion, inclusive cultures. And in the Ukraine invasion, this is even more the case because what is happening in Eastern Europe is having some very big ripple effects on, relationships between staff. And I think as well that the whole area of well-being is going to be very important in 2022 and 23. Workers increasingly expect their organisation to think about their well-being, and particularly after COVID, emotional well-being is a big concern for companies, and there's a lot to be done there. And I think finally, the whole revolution in flexible work that it's going on, we know again from our own data that having the opportunity to work flexibly, to have much more tailored working arrangements that suit you, that suit your needs, is a big pool for workers. And so I think that companies would be well advised to really get those flexible work policies in place. And across Europe, there are different regulations, and there are tax issues. So actually having that sort of enterprise-wide policy for flexible working isn't as easy as it sounds. And so I think companies really do need to accelerate their strategies there to be able to offer the flexibility that workers want.
Thank you, Marion. And yes, there's a whole array of responses, I guess, that companies can focus on. Just to paraphrase what you said, but I guess coming back to both what you said and Ilaria at the beginning, the employee value proposition seems to be at the forefront of this, and understanding that from many elements. And you did mention the shopping around. I do want to come back to that a bit later on, but I guess the natural next question is, if we talk about increasing wages and we talk about a competitive situation on the market, especially in certain sectors, I'd like to understand from both of you, maybe if we can start with you, Ilaria, is what about labor shortages in general? Is that a topic? It seems from your answers so far that it is, but I'd like to understand a bit more in depth what is the labor shortages topic. And specifically now, again, with the Ukraine war, will the arrival of refugees provide any effects on the labor agenda? Ilaria.
Sure, Sanja, good question. And I will try to put that in perspective because when you talk to companies, you always hear labor shortages. At any point in time, there is always a shortage of labor. And I think that is because there is constantly a shortage of specific type of talent. But so I'll try to give you some data points looking at the economy as a whole. And I think there are some signs, but we have to put things in perspective. I think for example, if we analyze data for Germany, the Netherlands, and the UK, we see that the ratio between job vacancies and unemployed people is around one, close to one. So it means basically there are as many unemployed workers as vacancies, which doesn't happen a lot in European countries. Now we know that in the US currently there are more vacancies than unemployed people. So the alarm level in the US on labor shortages is higher than it is here. But as I said, we really start to see some signs in European countries as well. So I mentioned the in general for the whole labor market, UK, Germany, and the Netherlands. Another data point which I think is interesting is the percentage of companies in the manufacturing sector that think that lack of labor is a limit to production. So this percentage is on average in the euro area 25%, which is higher than it was before the pandemic, but it's not record high. It's actually interesting to look at some countries. We analyze 11 countries in the report, and if we look at some countries, this is actually in the range of 35% in Germany and the Netherlands, so these two countries come back, and then even higher in the range of 40% in Poland, Denmark, and Hungary. Now, the fact that Poland and Hungary come up, in the very high in the shortages statistics, brings a connection, of course, to the question on refugees, because by now, we are recording this podcast on the 9th of March. There are 2 million people that left Ukraine, and most of them are in Europe already. And actually, 1 million, more or less, is in Poland. So will the refugees from Ukraine solve the labor shortages problem? I think there are some, encouraging, timid signs there, given the geographical match, but it's probably early to answer this question because we don't know actually how many people will stay in the countries where refugees are arriving, so Poland, Hungary, Romania. And so we don't know if they will stay there or if they will move towards, for example, Germany or France or the UK. We don't know what is that percentage of people that will move around. And we know also from past experience that it always takes time to integrate refugees in the labor market. It should be shorter in this case because the formalities have been simplified with the decision from the European Union. So it could be shorter, and that's another positive sign. But we know it takes time to integrate refugees in labor markets.
Yes. And Ilaria, before I ask Marion a similar question, you mentioned the manufacturing sector. Are there any other sectors that stand out in your report?
Yeah, we don't have as good data as we have for the manufacturing sector, for other sectors, but I think there will be some interesting seasonality emerging for example, the hospitality sector, because that's a sector where many jobs were lost, and as the recovery starts again, I expect a lot of vacancies to appear there. Everyone trying to hire the same workers. That's a little bit what we saw last year. And I expect this year to be even stronger because the COVID situation has improved a lot. So that's probably my other guess.
Thank you, Ilaria. And Marion, your comments about labor shortages, I know you mentioned your aha moment on the female labor force participation at the start of this podcast. Any other perspectives, and maybe particularly what are companies doing to look at the dislocated Ukrainian population that are now in other countries? How are they looking at that on their labor agenda, if you wish, or the skills agenda?
Yeah, well, I think starting with the Ukraine invasion, Sanja, as Ilaria says, we're seeing this massive advance of refugees, and many of our member companies are, putting in emergency planning, contingency planning, trying to help their own employees and their families. Some are also helping friends to either evacuate or to take them to places of safety once they do get to neighbouring countries. And I think that for these companies, I think they're very concerned to A, help their workers, B, ensure that they can keep working, so they're relocating them, or they're opening up vacancies across the organization. They're looking at international assignment programs to see if some of those can be used. They're looking at supporting workers who can still work, through digital sort of working. And so I think it's all about really trying to support and help these workers and their families to get to a point of safety, and to continue working for the company. And even companies that have had to close down operations are still keeping those workers, still paying them. They don't want to lose them, and they don't know quite what the long-term implications are for some of these operations. So I think that for companies, this is really causing them to very much look at their own organization as an internal labor market, and how to deal with this exodus of workers from Eastern Europe. So, and I think in a way that will accelerate some of those strategies that organizations already have in place to encourage internal mobility as a way of really, maximizing workers' skills and also providing opportunities for learning new skills. Which brings me to the second point about skills. So, as Ilaria says, we have this, this, I think it's a very sobering statistic that we have vacant jobs which match unemployed, numbers. And to me, this really speaks of a serious mismatch between the workers out there who need a job and the skills that companies are looking for. And sometimes people say, what talent shortage? Look around, there are lots of people looking for jobs, but it's the problem that the people looking for jobs may not have the right skills. So I think there is a very urgent imperative for upskilling, reskilling, but that takes time. So I think that companies are really starting to make very serious investments in learning, development, skilling, and but it will take time. But I think it's encouraging that companies are starting to really sort of pivot to look at this through the lens of skills, to really try and work to classify what are the skills they need, what are the skills within their own workforce, what are the skills that are sort of declining, what are the new skills, and they're looking at their workers and their skills profiles, and they're really trying to see how to do very tailored upskilling or reskilling, how to make very apparent to workers the skills that are transferable, plotting sort of career paths where you can see how you can move into perhaps a more future focused career path to jobs that you may have some of those skills and need to build others. So I think that's very positive, but it is the problem, it'll take time. So but again, it brings us back to companies, large companies, really needing to think creatively and long term about creating an organization that really facilitates internal movement, transfers, rotations, project workings, anything and everything, plus learning platforms that can help workers very quickly acquire new skills and stay ahead of the change curve.
Thanks, Marion. And I'm very conscious that we're approaching the end of this podcast, but to sort of summarize what both you and Ilaria have said, both in terms of the labor dynamics, skills, the arrival of refugees, the increasing wages, I'd like to just ask you one overall question, which is building a bit on what Ilaria said about the alarm bells going off in the US, where there are more vacancies than labor available. Do we have, is Europe, and do we have the Great Resignation? Is Europe going through the Great Resignation as we know it in the US? And what do you think will be the evolution in the next 6 to 12 months? Ilaria, maybe over to you first, and then Marion. Do we have the Great Resignation in Europe?
My short answer to that question, Sanja, is no. I think there is a risk in some countries where, the ones that we mentioned, where the labor market is really, really tight. But all in all, I think there are two elements in Europe that would probably avoid this phenomenon. One is the fact that there is just less flexibility in the labor market. It doesn't happen in European countries that you say tomorrow, I don't come to the office anymore, I'm done. There are notice periods, and in some countries they're particularly long, both on once the employer side and the employee side. The other reason is that there is just less mobility in general in the European labor market. So we will see, some resignations for very, top talent in very high demand, for which there is always shortage. But I don't think this will be a general phenomenon of the European labor market. Nonetheless, what we see, we surveyed our members about that, and what we see is that they are actually concerned. So many of them expect to see a moderate exodus of employees. They expect some quits to happen in the next 6 months. But I don't think this, can be called a great resignation. I don't think this will happen here.
No, I agree with you, Lara, as well. And as you said, talking to our councils, yes, there is definite concern, and it's interesting that the our heads of talent acquisition, who are at the coalface, are definitely, I think, quite strongly concerned. And I think the message is sort of wait and see, be vigilant, and certainly don't take for granted your current employees and whether at some point maybe they will decide to move on. I think there's probably some pent up demand over the last 2 years in terms of perhaps a lot of people feeling that they have stalled in their career advance, or that they feel that their salaries haven't really grown. So I think, definitely employees will be more vocal. I think they will be wanting to renegotiate and improve their current opportunities and conditions. Will it be a dramatic exodus? I don't think so. But of course, now the Ukrainian invasion, I think psychologically, that is perhaps going to change how people think about 2022. I wouldn't be surprised if people felt concerned, less inclined to move. And I think even more, they'll be turning to their to their employers. They'll be looking at their line managers, and I think they will be expressing what they want. And I think at some point, especially with the sort of this great change to hybrid working, this acceleration of digital based business, I think there'll be a point where I think why companies would be wise to refocus on the work that people are doing, and to ask some questions about what is healthy work, what's productive work, how can we make sure that work is satisfying um, amidst all these changes, and are we giving people the experience that they want in their work? And I think that's worth revisiting at some point, and it takes a lot of effort, but I think it would be something that would be wise to do.
Well, thank you, Ilaria and Marion. This was truly, really interesting and very insightful. And I must say, I can't wait for your next report later on this year, because I'm picking up throughout the podcast that you are expecting certain things to change and some dynamics in the system, which I guess is normal. So I'm really looking forward to your report at the back end of this year. Thank you so much to both of you. And thank you to our audience who tuned into this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our Insights podcast series or explore the entire catalog and podcast programming from the Conference Board on our website. Thank you.
This has been Insights from the Conference Board.